January 12th, 1994. Albuquerque, New Mexico. After dropping off a friend at a restaurant, 16-year-old Jonathan Francia is carjacked and abducted from the parking lot in his mother's Chevrolet Camaro. 5 days later, the burnt-out vehicle is discovered in the Arizona desert nearly 300 miles away, and Jonathan's charred remains are in the trunk. A suspect named Paul Richardson is soon arrested after it is alleged that he committed the crime alongside an unidentified drifter known only as Jason. While Paul winds up fatally hanging himself in his jail cell, the mysterious Jason is never identified or tracked down, so no one is ever convicted of Jonathan's murder. After that, the trail went cold. Hello everyone, and welcome to our latest episode of The Trail Went Cold. I'm your host Robin Werder, and today we're going to be covering a particularly brutal crime, the 1994 murder of Jonathan Francia. Anyway, Jonathan Francia was a 16-year-old kid from Albuquerque, New Mexico, who was abducted and murdered in an apparent carjacking before the responsible parties traveled to Arizona and set the vehicle and his body on fire. His story was once featured on Unsolved Mysteries, but this is not one of the more heavily discussed cases on the show, because the primary focus of their segment was not Jonathan himself, but rather famed facial identification specialist Jeannie Boylan, who is renowned for creating incredibly realistic composite sketches of unidentified suspects, which have helped play a role in solving a number of cold cases. And Boylan became involved in the Jonathan Francia murder when law enforcement asked her to create a sketch for an unidentified individual who is believed to be involved in the crime. Now, this is going to be a bit different than your typical Trail Went Cold episode, because even though no one has ever been convicted of Jonathan's murder, you could almost consider this to be a half-solved mystery. We pretty much know what happened and who was responsible, but there's still a ton of unanswered questions. Over the years, 3 people have been accused of being complicit in Jonathan's death. Paul Richardson, who died by suicide in his jail cell shortly after he was arrested, Paul's wife, Trena Richardson, who was formally charged with Jonathan's murder, but had the charges dropped against her before she went on trial, since investigators used some questionable tactics to coerce a confession, and a suspect known only as Jason, who allegedly committed the murder alongside Paul before he disappeared, and he has never been identified or tracked down. Trying to get to the bottom of what actually happened in this case is pretty frustrating, but since Jonathan's loved ones have now gone over 30 years without receiving justice for him, I thought it would be a good time to profile the entire story on today's episode. However, before we get started, just a quick reminder that The Trail Went Cold is a weekly podcast, which is currently available for download on several platforms, including Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, Podcast Addict, and more. So if you like this podcast, be sure to subscribe to it, and please leave us a rating or review on any of those sites to help spread the word. The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so if you would like to learn how to support the show, please visit our page at patreon.com/thetrailwentcold. For as little as $1 a month, you can garner access to exclusive rewards, including stickers and thank you cards, early access episodes, and bonus content, as our Patreon page has around 80 exclusive bonus episodes and archives, which are not available on a regular feed. So with all that out of the way, let us now explore the murder of Jonathan Francia. Our story begins in Albuquerque, New Mexico in 1994. Our central figure is 16-year-old Jonathan Francia, who lives with his parents, Larry and Betty Francia, and is the second of their 3 teenage sons. The previous year, Jonathan decided to drop out of Albuquerque High School as he felt that it had become overrun with gangs, drugs, and violence. He now has a part-time job at Taco Bell and is planning to earn his general education diploma at an alternative school in the near future with hopes of eventually attending college. On the evening of January the 12th, Jonathan borrowed his mother's red and white 1978 Chevrolet Camaro in order to drive to JB's restaurant, an establishment on Medical Arts Avenue. Jonathan's best friend worked at the restaurant, and Jonathan gave him a ride there so he could pick up his paycheck and check his work schedule. Jonathan parked in the lot behind the restaurant sometime between 8:30 and 9 p.m. while his friend went inside, but when he returned 5 minutes later, Jonathan and the Camaro were gone. Jonathan had a 10:30 p.m. curfew and would always call his family if he was going to return home late, so when he failed to resurface for several hours, his parents became concerned enough to report him missing to the Albuquerque Police Department. The Francias found it very unlikely that Jonathan would have taken off on his own in his mother's car, so there was fear that he might have been carjacked and the Camaro was reported stolen. Well, on January the 17th, 5 days after Jonathan vanished, a rancher discovered the burned-out Camaro in a remote desert area of the Navajo Nation, a reservation located in Navajo County, Arizona. The spot was nearly 300 miles west of Albuquerque, and when the vehicle's trunk was opened, a charred body was found inside. Even though it had been burned beyond recognition, the body was assumed to be Jonathan's, and an autopsy would later determine that he had been stabbed to death before the Camaro was set on fire with him inside the trunk. Since Jonathan had presumably been kidnapped from Albuquerque and transported across state lines, his murder became a federal crime and would be investigated by the FBI. Well, it turned out that on the same evening Jonathan went missing, a woman in Albuquerque who had put up her car for sale claimed that two men who appeared to be in their mid-20s showed up at her house to inquire about buying it. When the woman went outside to start the car, she claimed that one of the men put his hand over her mouth and tried to forcibly push her into the vehicle. However, she managed to bite his hand and scream for help before running back into her house and phoning the police. Since the woman's residence was located only 2 blocks away from JB's restaurant, it was theorized that these men may have looked for another vehicle to steal, and after seeing Jonathan sitting alone inside his Camaro in the restaurant parking lot, they decided to carjack and kidnap him and flee the state. The following day, on January the 13th, 2 construction workers reported stopping in the desert just outside the town of Winslow, Arizona, to assist 2 men who were driving a Camaro and had gotten stuck in the sand. They managed to pull the Camaro out before the 2 men drove away, but since they matched the description of the men who attempted to carjack the woman in Albuquerque, and the burnt-out Camaro was later found 15 miles north of Winslow, it seemed apparent that Jonathan's body was likely inside the trunk at that time, but the construction workers did not realize it. Another witness also reported seeing one of these men near the site where the Camaro was burned, and he matched the description of 27-year-old Paul Daniel Richardson, who had recently arrived in Navajo County after being released from prison. Originally from Alabama, Paul had served nearly 5 years at the Arizona State Prison Complex in Florence on the charges of burglary, theft, and flight from a police vehicle. While incarcerated, Paul became acquainted with 21-year-old Trena Yellowhair Richardson, who had 2 children from a previous marriage and 1 child with a previous boyfriend. Paul had initially met Trena's brother through a probation program before he became involved with her, and she developed an infatuation with Paul as she frequently visited and corresponded with him. In fact, when Paul was released from prison in December of 1993, he immediately moved in with Trena and her parents, Frank and Shirley Lyon, who all lived together at a ranch located 20 miles south of Winslow. On January the 4th, 1994, Paul and Trena got married without her parents' knowledge, before he immediately left on a trip to Alabama to visit his father and grandmother. And coincidentally enough, Paul wound up returning to Navajo County around the same approximate time that Jonathan was abducted. On January the 22nd, the FBI brought Paul in for questioning, and he did admit that he was in Albuquerque on the evening of the 12th, as he had taken the bus there from Alabama and transferred onto another bus to return to Winslow. However, Paul claimed that he never left the bus station and denied any involvement in Jonathan's abduction and murder. Since the FBI had no probable cause to arrest Paul, he was released from custody, but the following day, an off-duty deputy sheriff with the Navajo County Sheriff's Department was shopping at the Walmart in Winslow when he was approached inside the store by Trena's mother, Shirley Lyon, who said that Paul was sitting outside in her car with her daughter and was carrying a butcher knife. Shirley informed the deputy that Paul had confessed to her family that he abducted and murdered someone from Albuquerque. Shirley claimed that she didn't call the police about this because her family did not have a phone at their ranch. She hoped to get away by telling Paul that she needed to do some shopping at Walmart, but Paul insisted on accompanying her and bringing Trena along. The deputy instructed Shirley to go back to her car and return home with Paul and Trena as if nothing had happened, while he coordinated with the appropriate authorities. When the FBI was informed about Paul's alleged confession, they issued a federal arrest warrant for him on the charges of carjacking and kidnapping, though they held off on charging him with murder. Even though the body found in the trunk was assumed to be Jonathan's, he had not yet been positively identified, and while DNA testing was performed, the body had been burned so badly that the results were inconclusive. On January the 24th, the FBI finally performed a raid on the Lyons Ranch, but by this point, Paul was already gone, as he had forced Shirley to drive him back into Winslow and drop him off. Paul also reportedly asked Trena to leave town with him, but she refused to go along, as Paul wanted her to leave her 3 children behind, and Trena did not want to do that. The Lyons shared the details about Paul's confession with the authorities, and said he had told them that on his bus ride from Alabama, he met another man known only as Jason. But after they arrived in Albuquerque together, they proceeded to carjack and abduct a teenage boy before driving to Arizona. They eventually pulled over in McHood Park just south of Winslow, but while Paul said he had initially not planned on killing the teen, Jason suddenly took the initiative to stab him to death before they drove out into the desert and proceeded to set fire to the car with the victim's body in the trunk. The woman from Albuquerque who survived the carjacking attempt was soon asked to look at a photo lineup, and she positively identified Paul as the man who attacked her. A massive manhunt was performed for Paul, as well as his mysterious accomplice Jason, who was described as being in his mid-20s and having wavy, shoulder-length, light sandy blonde or sandy brown hair, as well as crooked stained teeth and a long pointed nose. He appeared to be 5'10" and had a medium build, and dressed in Western-style clothing, which included a velvet cowboy hat and horsehair belt. He also smoked and chewed tobacco and carried around a large, dark-colored backpack with an attached sleeping bag and metal frame. On February the 2nd, a witness spotted Paul stealing a green camper pickup truck in Winslow, and after she phoned the police, they soon found the truck by the side of the road outside of town. The location was only 5 miles away from the Lyons Ranch, and it seemed apparent that Paul was heading there before the truck broke down and he was forced to flee the scene on foot. A homemade spear consisting of a pipe and a butcher knife were found inside the truck, and Trena later expressed her belief that Paul may have been headed to the ranch to kill her and her parents. Police flew a helicopter over the area to search for Paul, and he was eventually spotted in a rocky canyon. While he later made an attempt to hide underneath the porch of a local residence, Paul was finally captured and charged with carjacking and kidnapping. He was once again questioned by the FBI and confessed that both he and Jason were responsible for abducting and murdering Jonathan. Paul confirmed that he had met Jason on his bus ride from Alabama, and they got off together at the Albuquerque bus station. The two men spent some time in the downtown area drinking alcohol and buying and using drugs, but Paul wound up missing his bus to Winslow, which is why he and Jason came up with the idea of stealing a car. They then proceeded to carjack Jonathan and placed his body inside the trunk of his mother's Camaro before they drove to Arizona and fatally stabbed Jonathan just outside of Winslow. Later that morning, the two men set fire to the Camaro in the desert before going their separate ways, but Paul claimed this was the last time he ever saw Jason. He never learned Jason's last name, but he did say that he believed that Jason was from Dallas, Texas, and provided a few details he had learned about his background. Paul was held at the Coconino County Detention Facility in Flagstaff, but on February the 4th, only 2 days after his arrest, he was found hanging by a bedsheet in his jail cell. Since he was still alive and in critical condition, Paul was rushed to the Flagstaff Medical Center, but he incurred such extensive brain damage that 6 days later, his family gave their consent to take Paul off life support, and he died on February the 10th. Paul was never officially charged with Jonathan's murder, but even though the authorities were unable to make a positive forensic identification of Jonathan's charred body, they concluded that it likely did belong to him. The Francia family accepted this ruling, and on April the 28th, they finally held a funeral for Jonathan and laid him to rest. But by this point, another individual had been charged with Jonathan's murder. Investigators had no luck identifying or tracking down Jason, but on April the 19th, they decided to bring in Trena Richardson for questioning. Trena's original story was that on the evening of January the 12th, she was supposed to pick up Paul from the Winslow bus station, but he never showed up. Trena and her 3 children then spent the night at a mobile home belonging to a friend of hers named Scott Johnston before Paul and Jason showed up there in the Camaro the following morning. At first, Trena claimed that Paul asked her to accompany him and Jason when they drove both the Camaro and a separate car into the desert, but she was not told there was a body in the trunk until shortly before they arrived. Paul then forced Trena to drive the Camaro the rest of the way there, and after they stopped, the 2 men set the vehicle on fire and then used the second car to drive away from the scene. According to Trena, Paul had threatened to kill her, her children, and her parents if she did not go along with this, and she even said that he violently raped her afterwards. However, investigators eventually learned that on the night before his death, Paul had supposedly told his father that Trena played a more direct role in Jason's murder. When she was interviewed by detectives from the Coconino County Sheriff's Department, Trena changed her original story and now said that when she was spending the night at Scott Johnston's trailer, Paul had actually come in and woke her up at around 3 a.m. on the morning of January the 13th. When Trena went outside, she said that Jonathan was actually alive and standing outside the Camaro, so Paul introduced her to both him and Jason. Jonathan apparently started talking about how he was going to be promoted and become the manager at Taco Bell, but this made Paul jealous, so he and Jason started attacking Jonathan and shoved dirt in his mouth and his eyes to quiet him. Jason then removed his belt and used it to strangle Jonathan before placing him inside the Camaro's trunk. But it turned out that Jonathan was not actually dead yet, and he tried to make an escape, but Paul stopped him and stabbed him to death. Later that morning, the trio took the Camaro into the desert alongside a second vehicle. After they opened the trunk, Trena said that she and Paul proceeded to cut Jonathan's body open and poured gasoline inside him before they started the fire and left the scene together in the additional vehicle. Trena also claimed that Paul killed Jason in order to keep him from talking about the crime and dumped his body in East Clear Creek, but a search of the creek failed to turn up his remains or any evidence to corroborate Trena's story. Regardless, on the basis of her confession, Trena was arrested on 1 count of conspiracy to commit murder, 2 counts of hindering prosecution, and 1 count of theft, as a piece of property had allegedly been stolen from Jonathan's Camaro before it was burned. 8 days later, Trena was formally indicted by a grand jury on these charges, as well as the additional charge of first-degree murder. Trena was held in the Coconino County Jail to await trial, and the state announced that they would seek the death penalty if she was convicted. Trena wound up pleading not guilty to all the charges and recanted her confession, so over the course of the next several months, her trial date would be postponed multiple times. Well, law enforcement was hoping to strengthen their case against Trena by capturing the mysterious Jason, so the FBI got in touch with Unsolved Mysteries and asked them to feature this case on an episode which aired on October the 2nd. Like I mentioned during the intro, the segment put heavy focus on facial identification specialist Jeannie Boylan, as she was asked to meet with Trena's friend Scott Johnston, and based on the description that Scott provided, Boylan would put together 3 very detailed composite sketches of Jason. But curiously, the story that Scott provided about his interactions with Jason differed a bit from the story shared by Trena during her confession. As you recall, Trena claimed that she and her 3 children had been spending the night at Scott's trailer before she was woken up by Paul at 3 a.m. on the morning of January the 13th. But according to Scott, Paul arrived at his trailer and knocked on his door at 6 a.m. that morning. He said that Paul arrived in a Chevrolet Camaro alongside a man he did not recognize, and Paul introduced him as Jason. According to Scott, he noticed that Jason's hand looked red, and in retrospect, he now believed they were traces of blood. Jason soon went into the trailer to take a shower, and at around 9 a.m., Scott and Trena left together to go out and run some errands. When they returned, Scott noticed that Paul and Jason were washing the Camaro and had the trunk open, but they immediately shut it when they saw Scott arrive. Paul then asked Scott if he had a gas can available, and Scott went to borrow one from a next-door neighbor. 1 hour later, Trena, Paul, and Jason drove away in the Camaro with the gas can and said they were taking Jason to the main highway. Of course, it was now apparent to Scott that Jonathan's body was inside the trunk the whole time, and the Camaro was driven out into the desert to be torched, but Scott said this was the last time he ever saw Jason. The Unsolved Mystery segment showcased Jeannie Boylan's new sketches of Jason, which Scott described as being amazingly realistic and accurate. The show also shared some additional pieces of information which had been learned about Jason, such as the fact that he sometimes used other first names, including Jeffrey, Jerry, David, and Roger. Jason had supposedly claimed that he was from Dallas, Texas, and fathered a child there with a girlfriend, and he also said that he had an ex-wife in the Dallas area with 2 children who had been fathered by another man. The authorities also believed that Jason had relatives in other towns in Arizona, including Flagstaff, Payson, and Pinetop Lakeside, and seemed to live a transient lifestyle. He often traveled by bus, hitchhiking, and hopping freight trains, and was known for frequenting Las Vegas and homeless shelters in Laughlin, Nevada. But in spite of this newfound exposure on national television, Jason still cannot be identified. While in the Coconino County Jail awaiting trial, Trena agreed to do an interview with the Arizona Daily Sun in which she retracted her confession and maintained that she never met Jonathan while he was alive. She said she only saw Jonathan after he had already been murdered and that Paul forced her to be present when he burned the Camaro, stating, quote, "He said that would make me just as guilty as him. He grabbed me and told me he would kill me and the kids if I didn't do what he said," end quote. At a pretrial hearing, Trena's public defender presented testimony from Dr. Richard Ofshe, a professor at the University of California, Berkeley, who was an expert on false confessions and believed that Trena's confession had been coerced. It turned out that Trena suffered from seizures and other difficulties ever since falling on her head and suffering a brain injury when she was 8 years old. The injury left Trena easily vulnerable and manipulated and emotionally immature, and since she also suffered from scoliosis and a tilted pelvis, she was unable to work and lived on disability payments from the state. Dr. Ofshe believed that Trena was easily susceptible to detectives who interrogated her for around 4 hours and told her that she would get 25 years in prison if she revealed Jason's current whereabouts, but receive a life sentence if she didn't. Ofshe concluded that when Trena confessed to having direct involvement in Jonathan's murder, she was likely only telling the detectives what they wanted to hear because she felt they would let her go. Finally, in February of 1995, Coconino County Superior Court Judge Fred Newton ruled that the last 2/3 of Trena's 187-page interview, including her confession and statements that she saw Jonathan alive, could not be used as evidence at her trial. This section took place right after detectives promised leniency for Trena if she admitted her culpability in the murder. At the time, the Coconino County Attorney's Office had a policy about writing out any deals offered to defendants by law enforcement, but since Trena was only provided with an informal verbal promise about a deal, Judge Newton felt that any statements she made after that were illegally coerced and should be rendered inadmissible. He also ruled that statements Paul had supposedly made to his father about Trena's potential involvement in the crime were nothing more than hearsay and should be ruled inadmissible as well. 2 months later, prosecutors from the Coconino County Attorney's Office requested that the charges against Trena be dismissed, as Jason had still not been found, and without Trena's incriminating statements, they did not feel there was enough evidence to secure a murder conviction. On April the 21st, Judge Newman agreed to drop the charges without prejudice, which meant that Trena could be charged with the crime again if new evidence ever surfaced. But before Trena could be released from jail, she would have to deal with some additional legal issues. At the time she married Paul, Trena was on probation for a pair of marijuana convictions from Navajo County, but marrying a convicted felon like him was technically a violation. After Trena agreed to plead guilty to this violation, she received an additional sentence of 5 years probation from a Navajo County Superior Court judge, and was finally released on June the 22nd after over a year behind bars. In September, the Francia family filed a wrongful death lawsuit against JB's restaurant and its landlord for having inadequate lighting and security measures in their parking lot at the time Jonathan was abducted. However, I have no idea how this lawsuit ultimately turned out, and this story soon faded from the spotlight. After 3 decades, Jason's true identity has never been established, but as far as I know, there is still an active warrant for his arrest if he is ever identified. If he is still alive today, Jason would likely be in his mid to late 50s, but no one has ever officially been convicted for their role in Jonathan Francia's murder. So I guess you could say the trail went cold. So this is definitely one of the more unique cold cases we've covered on The Trail Went Cold, because while certain aspects of the crime are pretty cut and dried, other aspects are still shrouded in mystery. I mean, it seems pretty obvious that Paul Richardson was responsible for carjacking, abducting, and murdering Jonathan Francia from the parking lot of JB's restaurant in Albuquerque, and that if he had not hung himself in jail, I'm sure the evidence against him would have been strong enough for a conviction, and possibly even the death penalty. It seems likely that Paul did this with the assistance of the mysterious man known only as Jason, but we still don't know who he was or what happened to him, and the other big unanswered question is just how much culpability that Paul's wife, Trena Richardson, actually had in Jonathan's murder. What I do know for certain is that this is one of the stupidest, most senseless murders I've ever seen, as it sounds like the entire motive for the crime is that these two idiots wound up missing their bus in Albuquerque because they decided to go drinking and get high and felt like they had to steal a car in order to travel to Arizona. The whole thing is all the more tragic because by all accounts, Jonathan Francia was a very good, responsible kid who usually did everything he could to stay out of trouble, but wound up being murdered simply because he gave a friend a ride to his workplace and just happened to be sitting alone in the parking lot when he got carjacked. And of course, Jonathan only became a victim because Paul and Jason made an unsuccessful attempt to carjack a woman just 2 blocks away, so this is the ultimate example of someone being in the wrong place at the wrong time. I'm sure Jonathan would not have put up any resistance if these guys tried to steal his mother's car, but instead of letting him go, they committed major overkill by fatally stabbing him and setting his body and the vehicle on fire. It's crazy to think that Jonathan was burned so badly that they could not even conclusively identify his body through DNA testing, and the authorities pretty much just ruled it was him through the process of elimination. A lot of the details I've just shared about this case were not mentioned during the Unsolved Mystery segment, as its first half was devoted to showcasing the talents of Jeannie Boylan as a forensic identification specialist before they started talking about Jonathan's murder. I certainly don't begrudge the show for doing this because Boylan is a tremendously talented artist who has created composite sketches in a number of high-profile cases. The segment starts out by making reference to the infamous abduction and murder of 12-year-old Polly Kloss, which took place in California less than 1 year earlier. Boylan was soon brought in to create a sketch of Polly's abductor, and it wound up having a striking resemblance to Richard Allen Davis, the man who was later charged and convicted of Polly's murder. Boylan was also responsible for creating the iconic composite sketch of the Unabomber, who was still unidentified at that time, and it turned out to have such an accurate resemblance to Ted Kaczynski that when he saw it, he went to the trouble of intentionally breaking his nose so he wouldn't be as easily recognized. So you can understand why Boylan was asked to create a sketch for Jason, and if he is ever identified someday, I will not be surprised if it turns out she was right on the money. Now, the Unsolved Mystery segment was produced after Paul Richardson's suicide, but the key detail they did not share was that Trena Richardson was in jail at that time, awaiting trial for her alleged role in the murder. I guess it's possible they did not mention that part of the story in order to avoid tainting any potential jury pools, but since the show agreed to cover the case at the direct request of the FBI, I think they were really hoping that the national exposure would help them finally catch Jason before Trena's trial took place. While it seems likely that Trena was present when Jonathan's body and the Camaro were burned, the state was trying to prove that she first met Jonathan when he was still alive and witnessed Paul and Jason murder him. The only real evidence of Trena's full culpability was her own confession, which was not exactly reliable, so if Jason was found, this could finally solidify the state's version of what supposedly happened. But what was particularly odd about the Unsolved Mystery segment is that it almost seemed to contradict the state's narrative. It featured an interview with Scott Johnston, who described his encounter with Paul and Jason, but his version seemed to be at odds with the story that Trena shared during her confession to detectives. As you recall, Trena's story is that she was scheduled to pick up Paul from the Winslow bus station on the evening of January the 12th, but he never showed up, so she wound up spending the night at Scott's trailer with her 3 children. She then said that Paul woke her up at around 3 a.m. on the 13th, and when he took her outside, she met Jonathan, who was soon murdered by Paul and Jason before they stuffed them inside the Camaro's trunk. However, the account shared by Scott during his Unsolved Mysteries interview is that Paul and Jason showed up at his trailer in the Camaro and knocked on the door at 6 a.m. Since Scott saw what appeared to be traces of blood on Jason's hand, and both men abruptly closed the Camaro's trunk whenever Scott came near it, this indicates that Jonathan was already dead by this point. But are we to believe that Paul and Jason arrived and woke up Trena at 3 a.m., and Scott managed to sleep through the whole thing while a murder was taking place outside? One part of the story which doesn't get addressed too much are Trena's 3 children, who were also spending the night at the trailer. Sure, they were all very young at the time, so it's not like they could provide much of an eyewitness account, but were none of them roused awake while all this activity supposedly was taking place in the middle of the night? Investigators argued that Trena's story about being present when Jonathan was killed had to be true because she shared details about him she should not have known, such as him working at Taco Bell and planning to become the manager. However, if you search through the newspaper archives, you'll find a number of articles about Jonathan which mention him being employed by Taco Bell, so Trena easily could have learned or been fed that information by her husband or law enforcement. While I'm sure that Trena likely was present when Paul and Jason set fire to the Camaro in the desert, some of the details of her account don't sound particularly believable, such as her and Paul cutting open Jonathan's body in order to pour gasoline inside. That really sounds like something that might have been fed to her by the detectives to make it sound like Trena was more involved in the murder than she really was. Due to the brain injury she suffered as a child, it sounds like Trena was easily manipulated and had a hard time maintaining focus, as she would supposedly change the subject numerous times during her police interviews and start talking about random topics such as her sex life and the illnesses she suffered from. It appears Trena also did not have many inhibitions, which would probably explain why she had 3 children from 2 different men by age 21 and was willing to marry a convicted criminal less than 1 month after he was released from prison. It's incredible that the extent of Paul and Trena's marriage was him leaving on a trip to Alabama immediately after they tied the knot, and then returning 9 days later with a stranger and a dead body to say, "By the way, honey, I committed a murder while I was gone and need to cover up the crime." Incidentally, the reason Trena met Paul in the first place was because her brother, Frank Lyon Jr., had his own legal troubles and became acquainted with Paul through a probation program. Well, in a crazy epilogue to this whole story, in September of 1995, shortly after Trena was released from jail, Frank Jr. wound up being charged with attempted first-degree murder and aggravated assault after shooting an acquaintance named Derek Mario Hoengawa during a barbecue at the Lyon family ranch. So yeah, it definitely appears there were a lot of issues in that family. Anyway, according to Trena, Paul repeatedly raped her following this incident and threatened to kill her and her family if she said anything. When Trena was questioned by police and given a medical examination a short time later, it was discovered that she had scratches and bruises on her arms, and she could barely walk due to internal injuries. So this definitely supported Trena's story that she was assaulted and only participated in the cover-up out of fear. But I really don't think Trena was present when Jonathan was killed, as she likely never had any encounters with him while he was alive and only learned about the murder after the fact. The way Trena described it, when Paul woke her up and introduced her to Jonathan, he was just hanging around outside the Camaro with Jason and did not appear to be under any duress and only got murdered after making some comments about becoming a manager at Taco Bell, which made Paul become jealous and attack him in a violent rage. If Trena's story was true, then this would imply that Jonathan left Albuquerque on his own accord and inexplicably traveled nearly 300 miles to Arizona in his mother's car with 2 complete strangers. Since Jonathan was known for being a very responsible kid, it sounds like it would have been incredibly out of character for him to just take off in his mother's Camaro without telling anyone and leave his friend stranded at the restaurant. Since Paul hanged himself immediately following his arrest and law enforcement had no success at finding Jason, I think they were just desperate to see anyone go down and face justice for the crime, which is why Trena was coerced into making this confession. You could argue that Trena deserves some sort of punishment for being an accomplice after the fact, but charging her with first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder and putting her in a position to face the death penalty was a major overreach. Since many of Trena's statements were ruled inadmissible, prosecutors really didn't have much evidence to take her to trial, which is why the charges were ultimately dismissed. While the door was open to charge Trena again if new evidence surfaced, 3 decades have now passed, so I'm pretty sure this whole angle is now a dead end. So it's apparent that the only way there will ever be some sort of satisfying resolution in this case is if Jason can be identified and charged for his role in Jonathan's murder. Paul claimed that he initially wasn't going to kill Jonathan and was planning to let him go until Jason took the initiative to stab him, but you obviously have to take that statement with a huge grain of salt. I have to admit that after I initially watched the Unsolved Mystery segment, I began to wonder if Jason was even a real person, and considered the possibility that Paul, Trena, and even Scott Johnston had completely fabricated him in order to cover up Trena's own complicity in the murder. But there were enough independent eyewitnesses who reported seeing Jason, including the woman who was nearly carjacked in Albuquerque, and the 2 construction workers who helped Paul and Jason when the Camaro got stuck, that I'm pretty certain he actually existed. But the circumstances of how Jason got involved in this whole thing are so odd, because if you believe Paul's story, he met Jason for the first time on his bus ride from Alabama to Albuquerque. So after arriving and missing their next bus to Winslow, these 2 guys who barely knew each other just suddenly decided to team up to commit a carjacking and a murder? I know that Paul had an extensive criminal history and had just been released after serving nearly 5 years in prison for burglary, but as far as I can tell, he did not have any prior murders under his belt, so how did things escalate to this point? The last confirmed sighting of Jason was provided by Scott Johnston, who claimed that he saw Paul, Trena, and Jason leaving together in Jonathan's Camaro, and they said they were going to take Jason to the main highway. From the information provided about Jason, it sounds like he may have been living a transient lifestyle, so it's possible he parted ways with Paul and Trena and hitchhiked out of the area. However, during Trena's confession, she claimed that Paul killed Jason because he was a witness to the murder and subsequently disposed of his body in East Clear Creek. A search of the creek and the surrounding area failed to turn up any evidence to support Trena's story, and it's unclear if she completely fabricated this part while she was under duress. Given how few leads there have been about Jason's whereabouts, it would not surprise me if his remains are still out there somewhere in the Arizona desert. But it's also worth mentioning that the Unsolved Mystery segment never made any mention of Trena's story about Paul killing Jason, so I get the impression that law enforcement didn't put much credence into it and were operating under the assumption that Jason was still alive. But let's suppose Paul and Jason really did go their separate ways, and Jason left the area before Jonathan's body was found. I just mentioned that even though Paul was a career criminal, he had no known prior history of murder. If Paul was telling the truth about letting Jonathan go until Jason took the initiative to stab him, then that might be an indication that this was not the first time Jason had done something like this. For all we know, he may have been a serial killer who has been responsible for other murders throughout his lifetime. I mean, one possibility is that Jason later got arrested for another crime and is currently serving time in prison, but no one has ever put 2 and 2 together. Throughout the course of the investigation, a number of details about Jason's possible background were shared with the public, and I have to assume these details were learned during conversations he had with Paul, Trena, and Scott. It sounds like he used a number of different first names, such as Jeffrey, Jerry, David, and Roger, meaning that Jason may not have even been his real name. Since he liked to travel around the country and apparently spent some time in homeless shelters, he may not have had any fixed address, though it sounds like he said he was originally from Dallas. The most interesting details are that Jason supposedly fathered a child with a girlfriend in the Dallas area, and he also had an ex-wife who lived there and had 2 children of her own with another man. Even if Jason was living a transient lifestyle, this seems to indicate that he did have ties with other people, so if he was killed in 1994, wouldn't they have started wondering what happened to him? Did they ever report him missing? I would be really curious to know if law enforcement has made any attempt to cross-check Jason with missing persons reports about young men from the Dallas area who matched his description and just happened to disappear during this time period. But of course, if Jason was not killed and he returned to Dallas and continued living his life, possibly with his child and his girlfriend, then no one he knew may have had any inkling that he was involved in a murder. Remember, even though Jeannie Boylan drew what was likely a very realistic and accurate sketch for Jason that was circulated on Unsolved Mysteries, the internet was still in its infancy back in 1994, and we were years away from social media, so perhaps the right person who could have recognized Jason just never saw the sketch. Whatever the case, part of me does hope that Jason is still alive, because Jonathan suffered a truly awful tragedy, and even though one of the responsible parties killed himself, the Francia family never really got to see true justice get served. If Jason was killed by Paul Richardson after Jonathan's murder took place, then there's nothing that can really be done until his remains are discovered. But for all we know, Jason may still be walking around free after all these years, and until the authorities can figure out what happened to him, this case will never truly be closed. So if you happen to have any information about the murder of Jonathan Francia or the identity of the mysterious Jason, please contact the appropriate authorities. But if you just have your own thoughts about what happened, feel free to leave me a comment or send me an email to robin.warder@icloud.com. That's robin.warder@icloud.com. Now the reminder that The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so please visit patreon.com/thetrailwentcold to learn how you can support our podcast and become eligible for some pretty neat rewards. Over the past 6 years, our Patreon page has released around 80 exclusive bonus episodes, which are all currently available in archives for our patrons in tiers 2 and 3. This past month, I released a Halloween-themed bonus episode about reincarnation, which covers the controversial Unsolved Mysteries segment about Georgia Rudolph and her belief that she was the reincarnation of a young woman who died at the turn of the 20th century. I've also dropped an exclusive bonus episode from my spin-off podcast, The Path Went Chilly, in which myself and one of my co-hosts, Jules, discuss a bizarre case from Unsolved Mysteries, the 1984 disappearance and subsequent death of Tim Molnar. And for our patrons in Tier 3, I've recorded another new audio commentary track, which could be played over a classic episode of Unsolved Mysteries, and we now have nearly 70 of these commentary tracks in archives. I just wanted to give another shout out to my supporters at the Unsolved Mysteries message board at the Sitcoms Online forum and the Unresolved Mysteries subreddit. I need to provide a big thanks to Miguel Foote, who edits and assembles this podcast together for me, and Vince Nitro, who composes the eerie music you hear on every episode. If you haven't already, you can like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter and Instagram, or leave us a rating or review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, Podcast Addict, or whatever your favorite podcasting platform is. So have yourselves a great week and join us next Wednesday for another brand new episode of The Trail Went Cold.